Good morning and welcome to our latest webinar. We have these periodically to provide stakeholders and the public a status on various market rollout activities. And today we will hear details about the Air Resources Board's latest AB8 report regarding the annual fuel cell electric vehicle and hydrogen station network development in California. We have two speakers today. Our primary speaker is Andrew Martinez, the hydrogen program expert with the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure section of CARB. And we also have Dave Park, our fueling infrastructure lead with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. My name is Bill Elrick. I'm the executive director here. I have with me Juan Contreras, who is our events coordinator, and we will be moderating and putting this on for you today. We are recording this webinar, and the presentation slides will be posted under the Fuel Cell Partnership's website later under our Resources tab. And for now, everyone is muted. And what we'd like you to do is use the GoToWebinar tool to ask any questions along the way. And we will answer what we can kind of offline as Andrew presents. But then at the end, we'll have some time for some questions and answers with him. And I believe we'll be posting everything we can as far as questions afterwards, and again, put that on our resources tabs of the website. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andrew and let's get started.
Thank you, Bill. So as Bill mentioned, this webinar is essentially a review of the findings, major findings and the content that we included in our 2019 annual evaluation of fuel cell electric vehicle deployment and hydrogen fuel station network development. We will also today cover some updated information because this report was published back in, publicly in the beginning of July. And so, of course, there has been a number of updates that have happened since then. And we'll cover some of that relevant information as we go through the findings of the report. We will also talk a little bit about special topics. In particular, for this year, we highlighted some of the past progress in the network and in California's overall hydrogen station program, the adoption of the hydrogen refueling infrastructure credit provision under LCFS and the status of stations that have been approved through that program, and our ongoing work right now on looking at the approach to financial self-sufficiency for the hydrogen fueling network, another aspect of analysis that is required under AB8. And so I will go ahead and get started here. So this report is an annual report. It is published in order to meet the requirements of what's known as AB8, Assembly Bill 8. This was signed by Governor Brown in 2013, and it allocates up to $20 million annually for hydrogen infrastructure investment. Those $20 million are managed by the California Energy Commission, but AB8 requires the Air Resources Board to report to the Energy Commission about the current and projected fuel cell electric vehicle fleet and station progress, assessments of the coverage and capacity of the existing and funded station network, and where we see there are gaps, where the next investments are most likely going to be needed. So we cover recommended station placement. We also cover recommended station capacities in various areas or methods for targeting types of certain capacities. We also are asked to recommend a funding level up to the $20 million that can be appropriated annually, and station technical specifications such as the fueling protocols that should be required, any changes to codes and standards, updates, et cetera, that need to be incorporated into future funding for stations. We've been performing this analysis and writing these reports since 2014, so this is the 6th edition in this series, and we will continue to do this annually through the end of the program, which is January 1st, 2024. And so the background here is really that zero-emission vehicles, which includes both battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles, are vital to addressing air quality and climate change. We need to get these vehicles out as quickly as possible in order to meet many different state goals for both of those considerations. And a key factor here is that we're really looking to enable industry scale up to a self-sustained market. The challenge is that essentially this requires establishment of two new industries, fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. And so what AB8 has been established to do is to help get this started and look towards how can we make sure that this is a viable, self-sustaining, and persistent fuel going forward. And AB8 was also predicated on a core fundamental aspect, which is the acknowledgement that in order to make all this happen, hydrogen fueling stations are needed to be deployed and operational and available to customers before the fuel cell electric vehicles themselves can actually be introduced into the market, because customers essentially will need to have the assurance and the comfort that they can know that there's hydrogen fueling available for them, that they could use these vehicles on their daily travels, on their long distance travels, et cetera, before they can essentially make the jump and make the decision to purchase the vehicle. So this has actually been quite a long journey in California. It starts even before 2005, but here we're going to highlight some major milestones along the path in California's experience with hydrogen and fuel cell electric vehicles. So as early as 2005, we had what was called the Hydrogen Blueprint Plan, and this was associated with what many of you will probably be familiar with, the Hydrogen Highway Program. And at this time, we essentially had research and development stations and vehicles. We were trying to look at, just getting, how would these vehicles perform? What are the basic necessities of a network and of individual stations? How should they, what kind of technology should be in place at stations? This was a lot of exploration. By 2013, we had the passage of AB8, so the funding for 100 or more stations with that $20 million per year that I had mentioned. And here at the California Fuel Cell Partnership, a roadmap was published that called for 68 stations that would be required to launch the market. And so at this point in 2013, we had moved beyond research and development stations. There had been a lot of answers determined. There's still a lot of questions even today remaining, but we were now in pre-commercial test stations and vehicles. By 2017, it's been widely acknowledged that California's fuel cell vehicle market transitioned to the early actual market phase. So no longer were customers being essentially screened. Essentially, you could go to any dealership that has a fuel cell vehicle available for you, and you could pick one up, and you could use the open retail hydrogen fueling station network. 2018, last year, was the adoption of the LCFS infrastructure credit provision. So this provides additional incentives for station developers to be able to receive credits under the LCFS program, not based only on the sale or the throughput of hydrogen at their stations, but on the actual capacity of the station. So this is aimed at potentially helping us get more stations out. It's directly tied to the goals that I will discuss later of Executive Order B4818 for 200 hydrogen fueling stations by 2025. And we are also hoping that it helps increase the renewable content of the hydrogen in our system, and also eventually helps bring down the cost to the consumer at the end of the day. In addition, another document that's very important was published by the partnership in 2018, which was the Revolution. So whereas the roadmap helped determine or help lay out a plan for establishing the market, the Revolution helps lay out a plan for getting to scale and getting to that self-sufficient kind of market, with the vision for 1,000 stations and that enable the deployment of 1 million fuel cell vehicles as early as 2030. So in 2024 is the goal for AB8 to have at least 100 retail hydrogen fueling stations throughout the state. 2025 is another goal that the state has for 200 retail hydrogen fueling stations. So you'll notice doubling the number of stations with only one additional year. So this is a challenge that the state agencies have been charged with trying to meet. And so far we're looking for the HRI program to really help us make up that gap, but also that AB8 would potentially be able to go beyond just 100 stations by 2024 on its own. And in addition, Governor Brown did sign another executive order that establishes a goal of zero carbon in all sectors by 2045. And so somewhere in this range of time, we expect between 2024 and this ultimate future of zero carbon, that the hydrogen network would be completely self-sufficient. And that's one of the efforts that we're undertaking to understand or estimate when that would happen and at what potential cost it would take to get there. Now, in terms of the overall strategy for the vehicles, essentially what we're looking at is today, obviously, our vehicle fleet is still dominated by conventional fossil fuels. About 2% of today's vehicle fleet in California is ZEV, and that includes plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So not quite the scale here, but you can see that little bubble includes hydrogen vehicles, PHEVs, and battery electric vehicles compared to today's conventional gasoline cars. So what we want to do is we want to scale that up. We want to grow that little bubble to be essentially, or to be our completely decarbonized market in the future. And this is going to require large-scale fleet turnover in the coming decades. And the challenge really is pretty daunting because this has to happen pretty rapidly in order to meet our goals. And so we want to eventually get to this market that's completely decarbonized, relying on ZEV options. And there are certain implications of this. Success requires ZEVs, obviously, that meet all the possible use cases. We know that different drivers have different vehicle needs, different usage patterns. Some people have to take their kids to soccer, others need to tow their boats for the weekend, others go to recreational activities. So all these different needs have to be able to be met by vehicles in the marketplace. And what we're seeing really is that fuel cells and BEVs and battery electric vehicles, they essentially complement each other, where one might face challenges for a particular usage pattern from a customer or a group of customers, the other typically excels. And this is just based on some of the fundamental principles of their technology, differences in the ability to store fuel energy on board, et cetera. And in addition, just the base concept that, having multiple technology options available provides greater chance of success and potentially a faster ramp up to get to this ultimate goal that we need to get to. And a concept that's been growing in recent years is also that both zero emission vehicle fuel pathways offer unique and exciting opportunities to help us get greater renewable implementation onto the electric grid. So this, in terms of hydrogen, in the world of hydrogen, has been often referred to as hydrogen at scale. That's an initiative that the U.S. Department of Energy has been undertaking for the past several years, a major initiative to perform research and development that will help enable this type of overall hydrogen energy system throughout the United States. And then one more final aspect that we would like to discuss as well is that the light-duty hydrogen vehicle or fuel cell vehicle market, essentially the light-duty vehicle market and the potential heavy-duty vehicle market have synergies in helping both of those achieve economies of scale. So with the light-duty vehicles, there are by far many more light-duty vehicles on the road, and so that larger light-duty market presents greater potential for achieving those economies of scale sooner because we have to build more of those fuel cell stacks, et cetera. And on the other hand, the greater per vehicle hydrogen consumption in the medium and heavy duty market presents greater potential for achieving those economies of scale sooner because those vehicles are going to have a greater demand for hydrogen and be able to help the upstream hydrogen production, distribution network, and all of that industry be able to scale much more rapidly than a fleet of light duty vehicles would. And what we're anticipating is that these benefits would be able to transfer across the different sectors. So we've already seen, for example, that Toyota has implemented the same exact fuel cell stack that's in the Mirai in their heavy-duty Class 8 truck that is being deployed at the Port of Long Beach. They also do the same with the Sora buses that they are deploying in Japan. And so we expect that the same thing could happen on the fuel side to benefit the light-duty vehicle customer and their fuel costs as well. This is a very simplified version of this concept. So there are many studies and many other sources that have a lot more detail and get into a lot more of the nuances of this. But overall, this is a general concept we'd like to, essentially share. Oops. So even though each year we report on the advancements in the past year, new information from the past year, of course, this is all built on past success as well from prior years and from that long history that I mentioned on the previous slide. So some of the highlights in California, we've had the first retail capable station right here in West Sacramento. We have the largest fuel cell electric vehicle deployment in the world amongst all the world markets, including Japan, Korea, Germany, etc. We do have a world-class fueling station network. Ours has unique requirements for retail operations. We made, as I mentioned, successfully made the transition to the early commercial market. We've seen that in California, the station development cost and build time is coming down. And at the same time that we're building this hydrogen fueling station network, we're actually seeing the station network be utilized more and more. And in fact, there's a companion report to this one that comes out every December, and we've repeatedly found that as fast as we're getting stations out, the utilization is even faster, it's growing even faster. And then as well, not only through the efforts of the agencies, but also through a lot of the industry partners and the public-private partnerships, we're really leading a lot of the standards development and implementation around hydrogen and in this industry. Since our last report in particular, there have also been a number of positive announcements and some momentum in the past year. So as I've mentioned, the LCFS hydrogen refueling infrastructure credit provision was adopted in 2018. The Energy Commission released a draft solicitation concepts back in January. And this solicitation concept would be for the next grant funding program, but it's notable because it adopts a strategy that essentially public and private partners are anticipating would help this market get to scale faster. It adopts a multi-year funding program that is more easily enables applicants to build a proposal for an entire network rather than building individual proposals for individual stations and having individual determinations on those stations. So this has been essentially a very fundamental and large change in the thinking around how to fund or provide grant funds to the hydrogen fueling station network. In addition, Hyundai announced their Vision 2030 for 40,000 fuel, which includes a goal of 40,000 fuel cell stacks being produced per year by 2022. Air Liquide announced a 30-ton per day hydrogen production facility that would serve California's fuel cell vehicle market. And Air Products announced a new liquid hydrogen production facility or liquefaction facility within the state, similarly for the in-state hydrogen uses. And so with that, all that background, we're now going to move into the findings of the report. Each year we consolidate our analyses into a set of findings, usually 7 to 10 different findings that are major conclusions for the past year. So the first finding has to do with the development of the open retail hydrogen fueling network. And so in 2019, the station network has expanded coverage and capacity mostly in the core market areas. So these are the areas where there's broad agreement that there would be the highest concentration of early adopters for these vehicles. So those are typically San Francisco Bay Area in particular. The 3rd Street station, we did count that as one of our open hydrogen stations in this report, even though it has not yet opened, but it was ready to be open at the time of this report writing. Sacramento area gained stations and actually establishes a small network of its own of interconnected stage 3 interconnected stations that can provide some backup to each other when they're all operational and open. And then, of course, there have been additional stations opening in the West LA area and building in more redundancy in that region. In this report, we do count 41 open stations in the report, and as I mentioned, that does include the 3rd Street station in San Francisco, which has not actually yet opened, but that has been because of a delay caused by a hydrogen supply shortage, which we will discuss. So finding 2 takes a look at what we had projected for the station network development during the 2018 annual evaluation versus what we actually saw this past year and what we continue to expect for the future. So currently we count 64 total hydrogen fueling stations, either open or funded and under construction and development. As I mentioned, at the time of writing this report, we had 41 open, and we were anticipating an additional 11 hydrogen stations could be open by the end of 2019. Now, for 2019, that is actually quite a bit shorter, quite a bit fewer stations than what we had thought we would have at the same time last year. We thought we would have 62 by the end of 2019 rather than 52. However, we do still see that all of our funded stations, at least as we understand, all of the funded stations that are still under construction right now remain having the expectation of being open by the end of 2020. So we do see that largely the station network as a whole is on schedule, even if some of the stations have moved from 2019 into 2020. And we also do understand that quite a few of the stations that are going to be open in 2020 rather than 2019 have moved back by a few months, by 3 to 6 months, rather than moving back by an entire year. Now, I just want to
Andrew, very quickly, I just wanted to, this is Dave Park. Good morning, everyone. I think that's absolutely accurate, and the chart reflects the status in early 2019. But some of the things that slowed the deployment of retail stations is the hydrogen supply disruption and other unanticipated delays by station developers that adversely impacted progress. I think that it's important to point out that the current network of stations is not meeting the market demands of today's fuel cell vehicle drivers. And but the automakers are looking forward to aggressive build schedules for all new high capacity stations, like the new higher capacity Shell and 3.0 stations that are just now beginning to come online. So we do see that there is a signal for growth in the existing network and a signal that that the stations can provide more volume to the market individually. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And yes, so we do believe we have seen exactly that effect that you are discussing, or that you mentioned. There has been a hydrogen supply shortage over the past several months, and that has particularly affected Northern California stations. And as I had mentioned earlier, we know for sure at least that has affected the open date of the 3rd Street station, as we knew it was ready to open right when that supply shortage began. And since the time of writing this report, we have heard that there are indications of other stations also having their station open date, or the retail open date, having to move back because of the constrictions on supply. And so one thing we do want to highlight about this figure on the previous slide, please remember that those numbers, the 41, the 41 currently open at that time, the expectation even for 52 by the end of the year, those were all current as of the time we wrote the report. So they're all based on direct communication between the public agencies and the station developers. We all, both CARB, Energy Commission, GoBiz actually as well, maintains consistent communication with the station developers themselves to make sure we have a proper understanding of what is the expected build schedule for each individual station. The reality is schedules and future plans are dynamic, and they are in flux, and sometimes even in flux at the time that we're writing the report. So, more recent information that we have today would indicate that we are probably not going to get to 52 stations, or we are not going to get to 52 stations by the end of this year. So that number itself would be lower. There is a possibility that some of the 64 stations that we are projecting for 2020, those may change their plans as well, right? Simply because these stations are in flux. We have seen in the past, for example, stations sometimes need to change their location due to unforeseen difficulties with permitting or other issues, and so that, of course, then moves back their construction schedule as well. So just to emphasize that, the map here from the report is showing those 64 stations that we count in the network, and at the time of the report, the expectation for when they would be open retail, and then on the right is essentially a chart that shows the phase of development for the 64 stations that we counted, and includes the 41 open retail at the time of the report. So our next finding covers projections for fuel cell electric vehicle deployment and observations of past deployment itself. So every year, the CARB Act distributes a survey to the auto manufacturers that asks about their fuel cell electric vehicle deployment plans for the next 3 years, and that is mandatory information. The auto manufacturers are required to respond with their fuel cell vehicle deployment projections for the current model year and the next 3 years. We also ask them for an optional period of data, which goes the further 3 years beyond that. And we take that information, we synthesize it all, and come up with an aggregate number of fuel cell vehicles that may be on the road in future years based on that survey information. The surveys themselves, we have noted in the past, the survey responses do tend to have apparently have direct impact from station network development progress that happens in the prior year and even in years before. And so typically these survey responses, even though we are essentially kind of getting further and further information in the future, it's really more of a taking of the temperature of the auto manufacturers' expectations of the vehicle deployment that they would be capable of putting on the road in the future. And so this figure shows all of the survey information for all the years that we've collected since 2014. The blue shaded area is all of the mandatory period responses that we've gotten so far. And that window, of course, shifts in time. So, and then the diamonds themselves are the end of period data for that year. So for example, this year was 2019. The end of the mandatory period was 2022, which was 26,900 vehicles on the road. That was the indication from the survey that we got this year. The orange shaded area does the same for the optional period estimates as do the orange diamonds. So the end of the optional period data was 2025 this year, which indicated 48,000 vehicles in 2025 from the auto manufacturer survey. Now, these numbers, this does indicate essentially a flattening out of expectations in the further off years. We do understand that, the optional period data, it's further out in the future. We also, so there is associated with it a lot more uncertainty than perhaps the mandatory period data. We also have seen in the past that individual auto manufacturers respond with varying degrees of information in individual years. So that has happened in the past. However, we also did find that, this 48,000 vehicles by 2025 is essentially not on the same trajectory of vehicles that you might expect to for a station network of 200 stations per the executive order B4818, and is not on the same trajectory as we were looking at in the Revolution document, which gets to 1 million vehicles perhaps as early as 2030, assuming the 1,000 stations are there as well. In addition, this slide also shows the CARB's assessment of the number of registered fuel cell vehicles based on DMV data. And so we can see that as of April 1st, we had 5,923 vehicles with an active and current registration. That's a bit smaller than the number for the same period you would find from the California Fuel Cell Partnerships values sales numbers, but those numbers have different periods of time on which they are actually aggregated, and so there should be a bit of a difference, a little bit of a difference there. Dave, did you have any input, any addition
absolutely.
for this slide?
Thank you. Thank you. And just to clarify, absolutely, the automakers, the survey data, it reflects production plans that are developed, that are very forward-thinking and look multiple years in advance of production. When the automakers make these plans, they look for certainty and confidence and in producing those vehicles, and so they're looking for certain signals. Those signals are funding of stations, and so through state grants such as through AB8, credit mechanisms, as you mentioned, the low carbon fuel standard capacity credits, and probably the most important signal is the actual build out and opening of stations. I think it's important to point out that Governor Brown did sign his executive order B4818 to accelerate the building of 200 retail hydrogen fueling stations, and that was part of his 5 million ZEV initiative. That signing of that executive order did inspire station growth confidence by the automakers. They anticipated that those 200 stations would be executed. In support of those goals, the state of California and industry together set a new long-term target of 1,000 fueling stations by 2030 as part of the California Fuel Cell Partnerships Revolution document. And that was a target to accelerate the build out of hydrogen fueling infrastructure, but the emphasis does have to be placed on target. There actually is no plan to build these stations. That target was influenced by the executive order. But the reality is the legislature chose not to fund the executive order. That hard market confidence, getting back to that target versus plan topic, a funded executive order would have been part of the plan to meet that 1,000 station target. So I think that just the concluding remark would be that the rollout and accelerated growth of stations is the visceral sign that automakers, auto dealers, and customers are seeking. And industry appreciates the new public funding mechanisms, but it's the certainty of funding plus the construction of stations that gives automakers the confidence in market stability. Only then is it possible to meet these levels suggested in the executive order. The manufacturers of vehicles need that certainty to roll out more vehicles. Thank you.
All right. So to further discuss that point a bit, so on this figure, this is related to finding 4, where we compare essentially the capacity of that potential 200 station network or 200 plus station network to the vehicle deployment plans that were, well, not plans, but the vehicle deployment projections that were provided in the auto manufacturer survey. And so what we see is that if we are targeting the 200 stations, as Dave mentioned, the target of 200 stations does not have essentially a grant funding program the same way as the first 100 plus stations does. However, CARB is doing all we can to ensure that the HRI program will be able to make up that gap to 200 stations beyond the 100 plus that AB8 may be able to fund. But as Dave mentioned, it is as of this moment a target. But if we are able to achieve that target and get to the 200 plus stations in 2025, the capacity, we found that the capacity of that network would likely be about 3 times the demand of the provided by those 48,000 vehicles. Now, so built into that obviously is an anticipated acceleration in station deployment and capacity growth by 2025. built on the combination of AB8 grants and HRI credits. And we should mention, and we do in the report, an exact match is not required, and in fact, an exact match is probably negative because you want to have a buffer of capacity beyond the expected demand. However, and we do expect that the capacity and the station count should lead the vehicles, as we mentioned before. However, we did find that there isn't a similar essentially trend between that the growth that you would get in capacity and station deployment if we meet the 200 station target and the results that we got back from the vehicle survey. So we did find that there was a mismatch between those two this year. It's something that we will just be watching as we go forward. But as you will see later on, or as we reported this year, again, none of this really changes any of CARB's recommendations for funding through AB8. And that actually is very clear on this slide, where you can see the green shaded area is the capacity that the currently funded network could provide, the number of vehicles that network could provide for. And you can see that and even though the purple shaded area, which is our target capacity, is above the vehicle deployment projections, the green shaded area is below, right? And you can see that those 64 stations do not meet the demand of the 48,000 vehicles that have been supplied in the vehicle survey for 2025. So there's very clearly a need to continue and keep going on with the AB8 funds. And as you can see also on this figure, we're going to need a bit more than 100 stations to be able to meet the 48,000 vehicles potential demand. So even though there's this difference in the long-term projections and the long-term goals of what the state's trying to achieve and what we received on the survey, we still see that there's a definite need to keep AB8 funding going at the pace that it's been going, the 20 million that it's allowed each year.
Yep, and so absolutely, I'd say, Andrew, industry appreciates CARB's recognition of the relationship between automaker confidence and station growth and meeting demand generated by these kinds of vehicle volumes. And the target to building 214 stations, that's very positive. It demonstrates support for hydrogen and fuel cell technologies. And industry, specifically the automakers, appreciate and applaud that stretch goal. But it does require context. As stated previously, the reality is the legislature did not fund the executive order. Industry appreciates the funding mechanism that you mentioned, the low carbon fuel standard, HRI capacity credits, but until station developers announce plans to actually build the stations under LCFS, there is uncertainty. When more aggressive funding spurs station growth announcements by developers, only then might these station growth levels accelerate and have a chance to be met, and support these vehicle volume, these fuel cell vehicle volumes. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So moving on to the next set of analysis actually looks toward some of the recommendations for the next funding program that the Energy Commission is putting together. As I mentioned back in January, there was a draft solicitation concept paper introduced. I believe after we released this report, the Energy Commission I'm going to get the date wrong, early fall, held a workshop to discuss more concepts, further development of those concepts towards putting out a new grant solicitation. And so Finding 5 discusses the potential to utilize a lot of work that's already gone on through our AB8 evaluations and through the Fuel Cell Partnership's 2030 vision to streamline the station location evaluation. So to help make essentially the evaluation process go as quickly as it can, at least as relates to whether or not a station is placed in an appropriate location and whether or not it's appropriately sized for that location. We developed a system that basically looks at that 2030 network that was developed for the Revolution document and says, okay, these are all the areas where those stations were, where it seemed to make sense that stations need to be. So there are some ineligible areas, but you can see from the figure, a lot of the state is eligible. And we identified different needs for different types of stations. So where there's going to be potentially we see a large growth of vehicle adopters, we would essentially want to have larger stations. But we did recommend that for some areas where they're still getting their first station, for example, where you know it's a future growth area, but it doesn't have a station yet. So something like Fresno, perhaps Bakersfield. Those stations may not need to have as large of a capacity because it's more important about getting coverage in those markets than capacity at this particular moment in time. We also do recommend the ability for connector and destination stations like the ones that we have in Truckee, in Coalinga, possibly Santa Barbara, although Santa Barbara is also a future growth market, to enable long distance travel and that kind of use of the vehicle. And so we essentially developed that map on the previous slide to say, okay, this is a classification of what would be required, and then this is a little bit more detail about what we had recommended at the time for the capacity requirements for stations based on their classification. I believe some of this was discussed at the workshop, so this is perhaps maybe a little bit out of date with respect to the most recent conversations between the state and industry members, but this is what we had recommended at the time. One thing I do want to, or two things I do want to highlight though are the use of HiScape. So HiScape is a new tool that was developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's essentially the first tool that we know of that provides a consistent, essentially a consistent ruler for estimating the capacity of hydrogen fueling stations based on a set of important but not overly descriptive or not overly detailed parameters about the equipment at the station. It does account for expectations of demand throughout the day and provides a 24-hour capacity or throughput potential per fueling position or for the full station as well. So we see it as a very valuable tool, a very useful tool. It's actually integrated into the LCFS HRI program as well. And so we recommended using that tool for the GFO for the upcoming potential grant solicitation. In addition, this system as a whole actually does integrate well with the LCFS HRI program, which does have certain limitations itself in terms of what is eligible to be awarded under that program, and some of the evaluation process within that program as well. So we found that we felt that this system works well with what we already have going on in HRI. Finding 6 stresses really kind of the message that I gave earlier in an earlier finding as well. But you know, we discussed a lot in the report about the vehicle deployment schedule, but it is also the infrastructure schedule. Both infrastructure and vehicle deployment need to continue, and they need to significantly accelerate in order to secure the state ZEV implementation and emission reduction goals. It's very clear from earlier slides, but here again is another version where you can see that, you know, to get to the 2025 goal of 200 stations, there's a clear acceleration in what has to happen between now and then in the next 5 years, and what has happened in the past, or what we've seen in the past. So again, we are hoping and we're targeting that the AB8 program will be able to get more than the 100 station minimum with the remaining funds by 2024, and that the LCFS HRI program will be a sufficient incentive for station developers to be able to get the rest of the stations out between whatever AB8 is able to do on its own, or possibly in combination with LCFS and the 200 stations. As I mentioned before, we are also undertaking a study of what it would take to get to network self-sufficiency. That's essentially financial self-sufficiency. How long would it take, and what potential state aid would be needed until the network no longer requires state funds as well. And so we do not have finalized results for that. And because everything is draft, that's why this figure has no y-axis. It's intentional, because we're not really prepared yet to put any dollar numbers out there. And in fact, we have new results now. We've been working with industry on fine-tuning some of the methodology, some of the assumptions, and we're working through newer results and wanting to. We will come out with some final results in a future AB8 report, either in a December report or a June report. However, we did find some things that seem to be consistent no matter what we do to the numbers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. But for example, on this slide, we found that even if the state were to develop some kind of grant funding program beyond what we already have, still 94% of the funds would be from private industry for building the network. So the vast majority of funds would be private.
I think that it's good to point out that industry very much appreciates the partnership process of working with ARB and other state agencies to move this market towards that point of self-sufficiency. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I believe this is the last finding, major finding from the report, but as many of you may be aware, there is a requirement in the state that all hydrogen dispensed through stations that receive state grant funding or state funding of some sort have to dispense hydrogen with 33% renewable content. That's traditionally been enforced through the grant agreements that have been in place with the Energy Commission for building the stations. It's now also incorporated into the LCFS requirements, and in particular in the HRI requirements, it actually goes beyond that. It goes to 40%. And so this figure shows essentially that for all the funded stations, once they're all built by the end of 2020, as we had expected them at that time, the renewable content would be 39%. So that accounts for all the stations that at that time had been in the HRI program, and we counted them as 40% renewable unless we had independent information that said they were 100% renewable. For all the remaining stations out to 2025 that haven't been funded yet, that we're targeting though, we assume the minimum 33%. So that's the only reason that goes down to 35, simply because we don't know if they will be more or less than that. But we're guaranteed to always meet the 33% renewable requirement minimum. I will mention that there are a number of initiatives. There have been a number of conversations, both public and private, to get far beyond 33 and even 40% renewable requirements, and to get to very low or zero CI carbon intensity hydrogen. So this is essentially a tracking of meeting just the minimum requirements that we have for SB 1505. And so with that, I do want to move into just a couple of highlights, additional highlights of analyses or information that we had in the report. One is the self-sufficiency analysis. So this is an ongoing work, collaboration between CARB and the Energy Commission. We are working with private industry to get a lot of information, to have some review of the methods and the assumptions that we utilize. We're stressing that we are not making a predictive model here. We're generating what's essentially a scenario analysis. We're generating the capability to say, well, if hydrogen price at the pump progresses in this way in the future, and if the capital cost of equipment falls by X% in the future according to some schedule, then the overall total cost for building a station network out to 2035 could be a certain amount, and there might be a certain amount of that is a gap that would need to be met somehow. And so this work is looking to essentially identify what that gap would be and the timing over which that gap would apply. And so the work takes our existing network as an initial condition, looks at developing various scenarios based on projected fuel cell vehicle deployment, which is translated into a station network deployment, and then generates outputs that are essentially built around a cash flow analysis. And so, for example, what we might get out of this, again, this is all normalized. There's no numbers here to really talk about. This is more for demonstration. But, we're essentially going to be developing individual station and overall network cash flows. One of the key aspects we want to have in this analysis is to be able to look at not just the total for the overall network, but also look at different stations located in different places that might have different capacities that are built in different years to try and kind of get a sense for perhaps there's some intelligent way to build a future program. Does it need to focus in certain areas or to focus on certain types of stations, et cetera? But here, this is an example of kind of the primary output where you could see cash outflows, which in this figure are being shown as fuel procurement, O&M, capital costs, and cash inflows, sales revenue, LCFS revenue based on throughput and based on infrastructure, and then also kind of the balance. And then this would show that essentially in this particular scenario, perhaps that balance point, that point of break even is in 2036, right? That's just for this demonstration. That's not a final finding. But this is the kind of thing we're going to be looking at. But then also looking at, as I had mentioned, on the individual station level. So we can build scenarios where we have stations that are of various sizes, 200 kilograms per day, 600 kilograms per day. It can be freely determined and assigned. But one thing that we found through some of our early draft results is that small stations, smaller than 400 kilograms per day, are pretty much always financially challenged. And this actually is confirmed by some interviews we did with station developers prior to putting together this modeling framework. And so these four figures, they actually show the same exact data in all four figures. It's just that we're highlighting groups of stations. So the rings from inner to outer represent negative returns for a station to very high positive returns for stations. And then each ring is broken up by the stations of particular sizes within it. So you can see in the top left version, all the negative return stations are very small. They're 200 kilograms per day. Barely any of them even make barely any amount of return. And even 350 kilogram per day, most of them are barely making a return, but at least they're making a return. Then that's shown in the top right-hand figure. In the bottom left-hand figure, we can see that most of our high return stations are the 900 to 1200 kilogram per day sweet spot. I do want to caution that nobody takes this and runs with that as a concept, because that is particular to this particular scenario. In the future, when we actually report out final findings on this, we'll be very clear about when these findings actually apply. But you can see in this one, 900, 1200 is a sweet spot because there's very few of those stations that are low return. They're all mostly pretty high return. Whereas if you go bigger than that to 1600 to 2000, you actually have more chances for having a low return in those stations. Part of that actually is because of limitations from the LCFS HRI program that those stations aren't able to enjoy, whereas these ones in the sweet spot are able to enjoy. We are also going to obviously do some kind of sensitivity analysis. So we did some with our draft results, and you can see here that really the biggest influencers of of what makes the station network more or less financially self-sufficient is the vehicle rollout. So larger vehicle rollout helps bring greater utilization, which then helps make the finances a lot better. Probably not a big surprise to anybody, but we're at least able to confirm that that's actually that has a bigger impact than some of the other parameters that we're looking at, even higher than, say, the price at the pump that the hydrogen is sold at. And then finally, we'll highlight that we're doing all of this in a way that actually lets us analyze network build-out scenarios that have geospatial information. So For example, this network is based off, that you're seeing here, is based off of the California Fuel Cell Revolution network. And we're able to basically take the results of cash flow that we determine for individual stations and then assign those geospatially. And so we can learn, whether there's just, is it always that all the stations in the Central Valley perhaps have more difficulty getting to break even faster? Or is it in certain locations? Are all those stations a certain size? So we'll be able to do that kind of synthesis on our cash flow results at the end of the investigation. And finally, one quick LCFS HRI update. So as I mentioned, HRI crediting has begun, and this is exciting. It's expected to do a lot of things, get us to more stations, bigger stations, or potentially do a lot of things. We don't know how many of these it will do, but potentially a lot more stations, bigger stations, lower carbon intensity, higher renewable implementation, and perhaps if we're lucky enough, lower price at the pump for the customer. I will mention that First Element Fuel opened their Oakland station recently, and that station has a price that's a few dollars below their price at other stations, and they have publicly stated that that is because of the HRI program, that they're able to offer that lower price at that station because that station's within the HRI program itself. These numbers were true at the time of the reporting. So we had 31 stations participating with 11,000 kilogram per day capacity. It's a little bit over a total of 41 fueling hoses for all those 31 stations combined. We estimated that, the LCFS program was about 20% subscribed based on the cap of the cap in place for this program. But today, actually, I think the most recent update was early September. There are now 38 stations participating with 60 total fueling positions and almost 19,000 kilograms per day of capacity approved through those stations. I do believe also that at least some of these stations have also been able to, all these stations are actually funded by Energy Commission grant funding programs. But I do believe that there may be one or two stations that actually have an additional dispenser added to them because of this program as well, compared to what they were funded to under the Energy Commission program. So that helps bring the capacity of individual stations up as well. And with that, we can move on to our question and answer period.
Thank you, Andrew. Exciting information, and thank you very much for taking the time today. So we have a number of questions. We'll try to get through some of them. As I said, we'll post the rest afterwards. We get these in as they're coming in. But let me start with a few. You have answered several of them throughout the presentation. No particular order, kind of how I see them and wrote them down, but there were questions about locations, plans for more stations and vehicles in San Joaquin Valley and Santa Barbara and other locations. Andrew, David, would either of you care to expand a little bit more on that?
I guess I'll start. So back with the roadmap, we had kind of identified this concept of connector and core market station areas. And the roadmap had identified, I believe, 5 core market areas or clusters, as they were called: West LA, Orange County, Berkeley area, the San Francisco Bay, and I'm blanking on the 5th one. And then, however, that was really just for the initial get the market going. The grant solicitation process has essentially tried to be a bit more flexible than that, because we know that the reality is on the ground. Station developers are going out there. They're talking to existing gas station owners. They're trying to make deals, find people who are willing to lease land to them to put in a hydrogen pump, put in hydrogen equipment. And so all of that, in addition, there's also permitting challenges with, and all of that rolls up into whether or not a given location is going to work, or whether or not a given location is going to work better than another location, or be able to be built sooner than another location or cheaper than another location. So there's a lot that goes into it. The grant programs of the past have provided guidance in various ways, sometimes built on those cluster definitions directly, sometimes built on other modeling in the past. The street model from UCI was utilized. In the most recent one, the California Hydrogen Infrastructure Tool, or CHIT, developed at CARB, was utilized. And so the station network has developed actually significantly outside of those markets as well. There's been a lot of growth within those clusters, but there's also been growth, for example, in Sacramento that perhaps wasn't identified as early in the roadmap. So going forward, as I mentioned, what we propose the Energy Commission utilizes, and what they did include in their draft solicitation concept, was adopting this map, which basically says pretty much most of the state is eligible for an application. So eligible for a station. So the question of when will a given area be developed or have its first station really comes down to whether or not station developers will be able to find a good site, a willing site that they can propose, and whether they will have a competitive application to the next grant funding program. The only addition to this then is through the LCFS HRI program. So now that that program is in place, station developers don't have to have a grant in order to apply to HRI. Of course, we're seeing that all of the ones so far do. But if they want to, they can apply just for HRI. And that program doesn't use the same map, but we do ask for similar types of information through that program. So basically, we ask for a narrative about why is this location good? Why is this capacity appropriate for this location? Do you actually see the utilization going up to, high utilization within a reasonable amount of time? What is, what is the information that leads you to believe that? All that kind of stuff. So within the HRI program, there's no predetermined eligibility of a location other than whether or not it's defensible from the applicant's provided information. So again, it does come down to the station developers being able to find a location. And I'm not saying that to harp on the station developers. I'm saying they have a tough job. They have to go through all of that work and finding these types of locations. So the state is not saying, yes or no, this location, that location on any particular time frame.
Absolutely, and I would also add that the OEMs, the automakers, publish a list through the California Fuel Cell Partnership identifying priority locations where they see the markets emerging. And as Andrew pointed out, initially those were the urban clusters, but now if you go to the California Fuel Cell Partnership website, you can download that letter and see where those OEM priority locations are. And you'll if you map those out, you'll see that the network is expanding to those destination and connector stations, and it's become more robust and is provided as also guidance to the, for instance, the AB8 funding program to identify where emerging markets might occur.
Great, thank you. Another question was looking at some of the targets, and specifically one of them was looking at the 200 station target by 2025, and asking, is that a realistic number? How do you want to maybe expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the 200 station number by 2025 is in a standing executive order. So that is taken very seriously by the agencies. We are charged with doing essentially everything we can to get to that 200 station number. And so part of our strategy has been the passage of the LCFS HRI credit provision, which was actually a program like that was also referenced in the executive order itself. The executive order also asked, I can't remember if it named the LCFS program itself. I think it did, to name the LCFS program and looking at ways to enable that program to get more infrastructure out, to support the infrastructure rollout. And so, yes, as Dave pointed out earlier, when Governor Brown issued that executive order, he also did propose funding to go along with that executive order, specifically for hydrogen fueling stations. That was not picked up by the legislature at the end of the day, but even without that funding allocations, it is still the responsibility of the agencies to still work towards those goals. And so that's what we're looking to do. We're really trying to watch the LCFS HRI program, make sure that it's appropriately utilized, make sure that we are going to get the numbers of stations that we need. We are doing analysis all the time, kind of looking at, making sure that the capacities of the stations, the program doesn't get oversubscribed too quickly, and then we only have like 20 stations in the program. So we're really looking towards making that happen.
I think that it's very important to point out that there's a great deal of appreciation for ARB and the staff in trying to meet the goals of that executive order, in light of the fact that the funding was not provided by the legislature. I think it's very important to point out to the drivers of fuel cell vehicles that this is a standing executive order, and if they're not satisfied with the tools that ARB is given, then they need to use their influence to call their legislators to point out that the executive order was not funded and you, the voting population, are not satisfied with the tools that ARB has been given. And I think this is a way the voting public can support ARB in its mission to get to the zero emission vehicle future that Governor Brown has roadmapped.
Good. And taking a moderator's privilege, along that line, I would, as well as some questions that talked about the steep curve from 200 to 1,000, and we recognize that's a very large curve, but at the same time, we are seeing progress. The station growth has been slow. The first few years were definitely learning curves, and you've seen the last round of station funding from, I think, 2015. Stations started to get in the ground around 2017. Some of them were up and running within 18 months. So the learning curve, as folks do this repeatedly and understand what's happening on the ground and in their long-term planning, we are seeing good progress. It doesn't mean that today the 200 isn't challenging nor running to 1,000, but between the progress that is being made, the collaborative effort of all the stakeholders, and the desire, from the government side to really get to the environmental targets and goals that we all seek, as well as the industry side to turn this into a market they can thrive and profit from, frankly, there's a lot of motivation here. So we're excited to keep working on it and building off of. Maybe a quick question is, there were some about the fuel cell vehicle projections. Were they all light-duty passenger vehicles, and did you consider the retirement or damaged vehicles along the way?
Right. So for the vehicle deployment projections that we provide here, so the survey itself is only asking light-duty vehicle auto manufacturers about their future vehicle deployment plan. So this is a light-duty vehicle count. This does not include any medium or heavy-duty auto manufacturers, or vehicle manufacturers, I should say. And then, yes, we do have a function within this that has vehicle attrition built into it. So for those same kinds of reasons, just averages that we see from the current vehicle market at large, for things like accidents, like you said, or other reasons that vehicles are retired, and that estimate is in line with our other tools that we have at CARB. Specifically, if anybody is familiar with the emissions factor model that we have, MFAC, which estimates future emissions from the transportation sector, there is a function in there for vehicle retirement, and we use the same exact function. So we're trying to keep with our other programs.
Great. One that for either of you, there was questions about the platinum use in fuel cell vehicles and being a limited resource, an expensive resource at that. Is this something that is seen to potentially hinder the rollout, or can you comment towards where that is?
Yes. So currently, platinum is utilized in the fuel cells. In the fuel cell stacks themselves. It's the catalyst that enables the electrochemical reaction for splitting the hydrogen into electron and proton. That electron drives the motors. But I will say that my understanding is that amount of catalyst has fallen dramatically over the recent years, from the time of those first research and development vehicles to the vehicles that we have today. I don't know if Dave perhaps might have the actual numbers. My vague recollection is, I think it's as high as 95% or something like that, reduction in the platinum. I do know that is a very, very active area of research, not only with the auto manufacturers, but also with the federal government. So U.S. Department of Energy has a fuel cell technology program, and one of their major pushes is catalysts. They are looking not only at smarter ways to use platinum and therefore use less platinum to get the same performance, and therefore bring down the cost as well, but also utilizing alternatives to platinum, things that themselves have a base cost that's less, perhaps are less costly to process or build into the fuel cells. And the challenge is always meeting a number of targets all at the same time, meeting lower cost, meeting high performance, meeting long durability, all at the same time with a given compound. Platinum happens to be very good at all of those things except for cost.
Absolutely, and I think it's very important to point out that all automobiles have platinum in their three-way catalyst, and the amount of platinum has been reduced up to 90% in the fuel cell stack, to the point where the fuel cell stack is using about the same amount of platinum as your typical automobile catalytic converter. So in terms of scaling, especially as the industry moves to further reduce the amount of platinum, we don't believe that's a limiting factor as fuel cell electric vehicles replace internal combustion vehicles such as gasoline vehicles.
Great. Now, so let me ask an exciting one we hear a lot. Battery vehicles have over a decade head start. There's hundreds of thousands of them on the road. Is the race over? Why do we need to invest in hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles?
So I'll go back to our strategy slide here. I'll reemphasize that, yes, that battery electric vehicles have a bigger part of the market right now than hydrogen fuel cell electric or hydrogen powered fuel cell electric vehicles. But when we are looking at where we are, even right now, we're at about 2% of the total market is ZEVs. And that's counting plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which still utilize conventional gasoline, and they're about half of that. So, projections that battery electric vehicles essentially have figured it all out or have won the race are extrapolating from 1% to 100% early on in the development cycle, or early on in the market development. I will also mention that, again, we see that these two technologies are complementary to each other. There are cases where a battery electric vehicle is not going to make as much sense for the individual consumer, perhaps for a consumer that lives in a apartment building that only has so many, so much ability to have charging supplied or provided in the parking spots. Or they may not make as much sense in terms of the infrastructure. Sometimes, it may be a greater infrastructure investment to build out the electric grid to support certain applications or certain sizes of fleets, especially potentially in the medium and heavy duty markets, but also it could have implications in the light duty market. I will perhaps speak out on a limb. Personally, it's simply just too early to tell. There's so much that's still unknown. There's a lot of potential with both technologies, but just because the battery electric vehicles have right now more vehicles on the road does not mean that they are meeting all of the needs for all of the people, and that's clearly not the case when they're 1% of the vehicle market. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when considering these two technologies. And just to finalize, just reiterate, the state's strategy is to support both of these technologies. We have such a large challenge ahead of us, full fleet turnover within a short number of decades. And to make sure we can get that to happen as quickly as possible or with the best chance of success as possible, we're going to have a lot more opportunity if we are supporting both of these technologies rather than just the one.
Great.
Absolutely, and I would also point out that there is a huge opportunity on the fuel cell side to meet what we call duty cycle demands that perhaps battery electric vehicles are challenged. Extremes in temperature, for instance, extreme cold or extreme hot, where the auxiliary equipment might pull down power. The storage of hydrogen is a more dense storage system, and then vehicle range. And probably the most extreme example is in the heavy duty sector in terms of trucking, where a truck might have to haul cargo. Battery packs would take up a considerable amount of cargo space in terms of weight to haul those loads. So as Andrew said, there is probably a place in the market for both technologies, or there is a place in the market for both technologies. And then the fuel cell vehicle offers a convenience factor in terms of the fueling experience. The fueling experience is a gasoline-like fueling experience, so that the customer can refill the energy supply in a shorter amount of time than current battery electric technologies can.
Great. Thank you. So I hear the clear call that we need both to reach our goals. They're complementary. We need customer choice, and a number of other reasons, from energy diversity and flexibility to succeed at both of these to get where we want to be. So the next one I'm going to propose as a question. I'm going to give kind of, again, moderator privilege an answer, but then ask you both to add if you see anything here. The question really is about finding more information on the Air Products Santa Clara incident, and has that been a cause for delay in the infrastructure network rollout? We still don't have a lot of public information there. I believe it was June 1st, there was a fire at the Santa Clara hydrogen distribution facility, which was used to fill the trucks, which would then go to the stations and fill the stations. We do not have much details on the incident itself, other than it did cause damage to the facility, it caused damage to a number of trucks, and it, as anyone in the industry or with a vehicle is aware, extreme shortages to no fuel in Northern California at different points. The good news is that the local officials have put the facility back, or given permission for Air Products to bring it back online. They've been doing that. Some of the first deliveries are starting to come out of that facility. However, I believe we expect it'll take several weeks or so more for it to be up to where it was before the incident. I do not think it is, I'll say, personally caused a long-term rollout delay but it has caused everyone to slow down, look at the facility. Maybe even some stations that were ready to open had to be put on pause because they weren't going to get fuel in the area. And yet, at the same time, we don't know what the long-term impacts may be on this. We hope they'll be short. We hope we will learn from this, both as an incident learning lesson, as well as something that we can work on for resiliency. We know it's a nascent piece of or part of the market right now, and that this is one of the challenges when you're building a market and you don't have redundancy, you don't have the systems all up. We see the same on the battery side. There are people, as PG&E shuts off power and other utilities, the same is happening for a growing charging network. That's just the challenge of being in this phase of the market. Well, as Andrew said, you're only 2% of the market. We don't have the resiliency a 100-year gasoline and diesel system has. So there's more on either of yours to say, but I don't want to shy away from this issue. What we do know, we will make available as soon as we know more.
Yeah, I think the things I just would want to add is that obviously this was an unforeseen event. However, the state has, even prior to this, started trying to, well, we've highlighted the potential for shortages of hydrogen supply. Particularly, we had an analysis more to do with production capacity rather than distribution. But those are both two very important aspects of the network overall. And the Energy Commission has actually taken that to heart, and they have funded 2 100% renewable hydrogen production facilities within the state. And they have right now an active solicitation for low or zero carbon fuel production, and I believe there have been some hydrogen-based applications to that program. They've also, within the Clean Transportation Program for the next year, flagged, and believe I'm going to get this number wrong, but I believe it's 10 million, 12 million for low, again, for more low to zero carbon fuel production facilities for California. So this is something that this is a challenge we're aware of. It's not only going to be the state. I think it does take a lot of effort also on the industry side, and you're seeing some of that happen, like with Elrick's announcement of a new 30 ton per day facility. That's huge, at least in terms of what our vehicle market is right now, and the Air Products new facility that they're going to open up as well, both to serve California's market. So I will say it's a known challenge, and it's not something that's being ignored, but it does take time to address.
And I think that it's important to point out the significance of the supply disruption, because it did, as Andrew pointed out in his finding too, it impacted the rollout of stations this year, and the rollout has been delayed because of the disruption, because the developers of stations did not want to add further stress to the existing supply network. But to end on a positive point, First Element Fuel, the True Zero stations, they announced that they are diversifying their portfolio to include liquid hydrogen to introduce a more robust distribution system.
Great, thank you. And I know, Andrew, you spoke a little bit about this in your presentation, and you touched upon it again recently, but it's always good to come back to this subject for where our end goals are. But what are the renewable requirements again for hydrogen now, and are there future targets beyond these?
So right now, there's a 33% renewable requirement for the hydrogen dispensed at stations that have received state funding. There is also a trigger for when that requirement would apply to any station in the state that is built without state funding. There's limited application of that because we don't actually have a station that is 100% privately funded right now. The trigger for that is based on vehicle fuel sales, hydrogen vehicle fuel sales. And we anticipate we'll actually hit that trigger either this year or next year anyways. So essentially every station in the state will soon be required to dispense 33%. So that's required of every station. However, in addition to that, if a station wants to be eligible for the infrastructure credits through the LCFS program, they actually have to go beyond that and have to have 40% of their hydrogen be renewably sourced. And there are, of course, certain requirements in terms of the accounting of that and what sources count for renewable, et cetera. But I would encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at the LCFS program, the definitions and the regulation, and if need be, get in touch with our LCFS program staff at CARB.
Yeah, I think what I would say from the partnership standpoint, again, thank you, David, for letting me jump in on this. The Hydrogen Council, an international group of industry players, have already declared that they're looking at a goal of 100% decarbonized hydrogen by 2030. Here in the state of California, we're looking at that target. We're also looking at the grid SB 100 100% renewable by 2045, and we're trying to identify what's a reasonable, rational, and achievable scaling up from today's percentages to where we want to end up. Again, we need to keep moving on this. We're excited that right now it's the leading renewable requirement of all the fuels out there, but we need to go farther. Another question that, again, was discussed a bit, but again, good to go back to, is there was a few questions about the capacities of the existing stations and the minimum capacities. And some of the questions centered around the current network minimum station capacity seems rather large in some of the questions there. And, what are the current utilization rates? Let me rephrase it. I'm going to try to package several questions into one. With where we are in the market now, are those minimum capacity requirements, are they large? Are they small? What is the utilization rate? How do you see that growing? Where do we need to go?
So I think our most recent December AB8 report, which is a joint agency staff report between the Energy Commission and CARB, I believe we found that network-wide average overall, the network was about, I want to say 36% utilized. That's the network average though. We do know that there are individual stations in highly utilized locations that actually run out of hydrogen, that are essentially 100% utilized. Sometimes on given days, they might have multiple additional or extra deliveries of hydrogen than what they get on it, than what they actually schedule for on a typical day or on a typical week. So there are individual stations that are highly utilized, essentially running out of hydrogen on certain days of the year. But overall, we're at about 36% utilization. I think we're probably higher than that right now. That's as of last December. Well, when we have the data analysis completed for the next December report, we'll be able to give an updated figure. I will say that from all of our understanding of our conversations with industry, our analysis also that we're doing through the self-sufficiency evaluation, other analyses that we've done of what our current network can supply versus even the vehicle projections that we've received from the auto manufacturers. The early stations were definitely smaller stations. We know that the stations of the future are going to be larger. The stations that are in the ground from past solicitations are largely single dispenser, one pump. That can cause lines, that can cause issues of availability beyond just whether or not the station is up or down. It's whether or not you can even get to the fuel pump in time to meet your needs for the day. Newer stations that are coming online right now are at least 2 dispensers. I believe the Oakland, I think the Oakland station is 2, but we know that many of the other stations that are in the pipeline that are being built right now are 3 and 4 fueling positions. And that still is, as big as that sounds, that's actually still pretty small compared to what you see for many gas stations, right? Think of your local gas stations around and how many of them have, just four hoses at them, right? So it's going to be, we are anticipating growth in capacity. It helps the finances. It helps get more vehicles out there. And it will be a welcome addition. So, what we have right now, it's actually, we are very glad for what we do have. It is what enabled the vehicle market launch. But it was definitely built for that early time of getting to open retail, or getting to retail network, and getting to the early commercial deployment of the vehicles. But to get to further deployment, get to scale, we know we're going to need to see bigger hydrogen stations, much bigger.
Absolutely, and I think that it gets to this question of capacity and coverage. I think both are necessary. Higher capacity stations are very helpful, but also increased coverage. So more stations would also be extremely beneficial to the market at this time. I think it's very important to point out that 33% value is an average. There are stations that are, as Andrew clearly pointed out, 100% utilized. There are stations that lie, for the most part, unused, but are necessary. They're connector stations that don't see as much traffic, but they're clearly important for a robust network. So I think it's important to point out that both capacity and coverage are, again, go hand in hand.
Great, and we're running out of time, but I wanted to at least address, I'll say one question, but several questions on medium and heavy duty. And those questions all centered around what were the plans there, what's happening. In essence, the light duty started first, and we talked a lot about that, but we've always focused on heavy duty. I would point out that just last month, the Fuel Cell Partnership published our most recent roadmap for fuel cell electric buses, and that was specifically intended to help achieve the recent CARB regulation of the Innovative Clean Transit Rule, which puts transit agencies on the same zero emission path starting in 2029 for requirement for all purchases to be ZEVs. And it looks at how to help achieve that target. Fuel cell electric buses, which like the light duty can be a one-for-one replacement for the diesel and CNG buses that are on the market today. And they're very close to cost competitiveness, and that's what we're trying to achieve next. The fuel cell electric trucks, we're seeing some of the first demonstrations on the road now, and we're learning a lot from those first pieces. They will learn much more quickly in that they can leverage the lessons from both the fuel cell buses as well as the light duty market. Andrew pointed out the synergy between light duty and heavy duty rollout, and how we need both to succeed to bring costs down on stacks and infrastructure. And what we're doing there at the partnership is working on identifying the priorities going forward, the metrics and milestones needed, and a rollout strategy for trucks based on those first demonstrations. So look for more from us on the heavy duty side in the coming months and years. And with that, what I would really like to do, or I'd like to do, is really thank Andrew and Dave for the time. All the hard work that was put into that report. We're excited for what you did and what you continue to do, and keep pushing us forward. And thank you everyone for the time today. We will post the questions, answers, and this webinar recording in the near future. Thank you very much.